Now, there's several ways that MAC addresses can be learnt. The first is static, where you statically configure specific MAC addresses that are allowed or permitted on a port. Any MAC addresses that you don't specify are not allowed on the port. The advantage with this method is that you have a lot of control, but the disadvantage is that you have to manually work out what the MAC addresses are of all your devices and then manually configure them. You could also use dynamic learning, where you specify how many MAC addresses are permitted on a port, and they are dynamically learnt. So as an example, you could say that only 2 MAC addresses are permitted on a port, and the first 2 MAC addresses that are learnt are permitted. Any subsequent MAC addresses are not permitted. You would use this as an example to limit the MAC addresses permitted, but not which MAC addresses are permitted. So you're limiting the number of MAC addresses and not limiting based on specific MAC addresses. The thing to remember about dynamic learning is that when the switch is rebooted or the port goes down, the MAC addresses learnt are removed, and new MAC addresses would then be permitted when the port comes up again. You could also specify an aging interval to allow MAC addresses to be forgotten after a period of time. So if you had a situation where you had a hot desk or a boardroom, you may only allow a certain number of MAC addresses on a port, but those MAC addresses can change over time. You could also do a combination of static and dynamic learning, where you explicitly permit certain MAC addresses. So as an example, you could limit the number of MAC addresses on a port to 4, but only statically configure 2 MAC addresses. The remaining 2 MAC addresses can be dynamically learnt. The static MAC addresses do not age out, but you could allow the dynamically learnt MAC addresses to age out. Sticky learning allows you to automatically add a learnt MAC address to the running configuration of the switch. So rather than statically configuring MAC addresses, you could allow the switch to learn MAC addresses and then add them to the configuration. When you save your running configuration to startup configuration, those MAC addresses will be kept in NVRAM and therefore won't be lost if the switch reboots. So there are various options. Remember, port security is an initial way to implement security. It allows you to limit the number of MAC addresses permitted on a port, and it allows you to specify which MAC addresses are permitted on a port. You have the option of just permitting 2 MAC addresses on a port, but not worrying what those MAC addresses are. They would stop a user bringing an access point or home router to work and plugging it into the network and allowing their friends to access the network. Or you could be stricter and only allow specific MAC addresses on a port, so a user can't connect to a director's port and therefore have access to the director's VLAN.